Welcome everyone, Stealthy Shrown here, and today I'm bringing you my review of Monster Harvest. Maple Powered Games developed Monster Harvest and released it at the end of August 2021. You play as a resident of Planimal Point, where you farm, mine, and fish to make a living. Also, you use little creatures that you literally grow to fight for you or act as domesticated animals. To put it simply, it's a game that blends Stardew Valley / Harvest Moon with Pokemon. A fairly unique concept for the genre, but it's plagued with a myriad of issues that hold it back from anything truly fun. Let's start with one of the biggest positives for the game though, and that's its graphics. I really like the art direction for this game. Everything is really vibrant with highly saturated colors. The game does a nice job in providing a feeling of depth to the environment and buildings. I think looking solely at screenshots of the game makes it very inviting for a lot of people. The only real gripe I had with the graphics was the main character's player model for the guy choices. I mean, what the heck is that thing on my face? A mask, I guess? Or maybe a bandana. As stories go, this one isn't anything too special. Your character is the niece or nephew of Uncle Spark, an eccentric scientist who discovered he can turn plants into animals, which he cleverly named Planimals. He invites the player to live on his farm and care for it so that he can concentrate on his research. And that's it. At first, there seems like there's a larger narrative with the malicious corporation known as Slime Co. trying to take advantage of the town's discovery. But it's swept under the rug quickly and isn't mentioned that much after the initial setup. However, I don't think these types of games usually have the strongest of stories anyway. It's the characters that matter the most. I tend to remember several of the charming characters in games like Stardew Valley or Friends in Mineral Town. However, Monster Harvest doesn't have any of that. Other than the uncle and maybe a couple others, I can't say I even know anyone's name. Beyond that, I can't even say what each person did or what was their place in the game, whether from their occupation or personality. Each character only has a couple of lines, and they say the same thing every day, forever. It doesn't change from season to season, or if you raise your relationship with them. There's no romance in the game too, in case you were wondering that. And quite honestly, I don't even think the relation system is something worthwhile. It's a tacked-on system that adds no value. In fact, it quite literally was one of the final things added to the game based on a dev video. There's very little in the way of defining any of these townspeople, which is a bummer. And that trend of a tacked-on feeling or something that wasn't thought out thoroughly persists through almost every other facet of gameplay. I'll start with the monster collecting and fighting side of the game. Basically, the game's main selling point. Yeah, it's just not fun. It goes something like this. You get your creature by applying a slime to a crop. A red slime creates a fighting planimal, while a blue one outputs a domesticated animal similar to a cow, chicken, or something like that. You can also apply super slimes to your crops. Using a red super slime gives the player a souped up version of the fighting creature, which basically is a color swap and added health. A blue super slime produces a mount that you could ride. Anyway, when the crop matures, you get that crop's exclusive monster. As far as I could tell, that creature has no stats besides its moveset and a health bar. So every monster from that specific type of crop is exactly the same. Also, despite different appearances of the monsters, there didn't seem to be any different types, such as water or fire types, or a rock-paper-scissors system of any kind. I felt this was a missed opportunity, but when you take a second to examine the combat system, you could kind of see why it wouldn't work without robust changes. Each fight is between two creatures, yours and the enemy. Even though you could have a number of planimals in your party, the only one allowed to participate in a fight is your active planimal in the first party slot. The next jumps in only if the first dies in combat. Furthermore, each of the monsters only have a max of 3 moves, and to make matters even worse, they don't have all 3 of their moves until they hit level 8. Although, that's not to say the combat gets interesting at level 8. It doesn't. At first, the fights consist of clicking the basic attack button over and over until it finishes. Then rinse and repeat. As you level up, your planimals get stronger attacks, buff or debuff moves. There's no real strategy or interesting choices here though. Do I do a basic attack, strong attack, or damage over time attack? On paper this might seem fine, but in practice it's bland and boring. In other games, there are usually other variables affecting the outcome of an encounter, such as consumables, stats, or some sort of environment effects, etc. Here, there's none of that, leading to a long slog. As this is the selling point, it's also a large portion of the game. The player will probably spend most of their time in the dungeon, which is where 95% of all the fights take place. The other 5% is in the rec center, which acts as a place to battle other people's planimals. However, this is more of the same, with your planimal needing to fight consecutive battles back to back. In the beginning, this doesn't seem so bad because you can't survive in the dungeon that long, but in a short time you'll have a party strong enough to cover the entirety of the dungeon. You'll be spending as much time as you can mining for resources and fighting creatures for seeds. But wait, I may hear you asking, what about time? Don't you need to leave to go to bed? While this could be something that grants you a mercy and cuts your night short, that's just not a thing in this game. The only way to go from day to night is to sleep in your bed. Time management doesn't exist in Monster Harvest, so the only thing you have to worry about in your day-to-day is stamina management. I've read several complaints saying that stamina costs are too harsh in the beginning of the game, and I really didn't think so. Maybe in the first few days, sure. But using the food that you forage and consumables you get from creatures in the dungeon, you can continue on for a long time. In the beginning, you need to conserve energy to mine in the dungeon because you can only enter at night for whatever arbitrary reason. However, eventually I got to a point where I'd come out of the dungeon with almost a full bar of stamina and a bunch of consumables I could still use to replenish me. And I didn't play this game long either. I spent a little over 20 hours in the game. There are only 3 seasons, dry, wet, and dark. I'd say if you're actually playing the game as intended, then each season probably takes about 10 hours. But I sped through my final season by just immediately going to bed so I could get to the event day since I had nothing to do. Yes, you heard me right. I had nothing to do in my first year with the game. Definitely don't expect anything like Stardew Valley here. By the end of the first season, I maxed out my overall level, which unlocked all the recipes. I also beat the dungeon. Around the beginning of the second season, I had every tool upgraded to the max, and all the available fish fished up in about 3 days. My buildings were all upgraded by about the end of the second season, and I'm not an efficient player. I'm sure all of these things can be done a lot faster. The devs definitely didn't put any real long-term content here, which can be okay, but I really think they underestimated what their player base would be capable of. Sometimes I'd get a person coming to my door and telling me about some stuff that I had already been doing or did, which led me to think that the devs felt my progress should be at a certain point that I had already passed. So now you're probably saying, okay, sure, the game is short, that's fine. The story is meh. That's fine, I don't really play these games for that. The monster fighting aspect of the game is gimmicky, and doesn't add a whole lot. Okay, that's fine. I'm just here for the peaceful farming and other activities these games provide. Well, I think you'll want to look elsewhere for that too. As I've already stated, nothing about these systems seemed very well thought out. I felt the devs team's decision making was, let's add this because it was in other games like this, and then proceed to not test if it's fun or not. Obviously, that's a bit facetious. But, say fishing, for example. It's a system in place that exists kind of in a bubble. It's stupidly easy to fish in this game, and besides the location and time of day, there's really nothing else you need to consider. There's no bait to affect the ease of the catch, no difference to the quality of the fish, and it doesn't really affect any other system. I guess you can make the argument that if you use it in cooking, then you can get a stamina boost, but I'd imagine that by the time you have the ability to cook, none of these recipes are even remotely useful anymore for the resource cost required. Also, the rewards don't really seem to make much sense to the overall gameplay. Like with raising domesticated animals, once you actually have a barn and some animals to feed, the animals don't have any relationship values that they might in other games. You need to feed the animals every day, but you don't need to buy or grow food for them because it's automatically provided for you. Then, as you upgrade the barn, you can add auto feeders and auto harvesters. On paper, this sounds great. Let's give the player some automation and free up time to do other things. But in execution, it completely cuts the system out of the gameplay loop entirely, as you don't need to do anything anymore. The animals won't get sick, pregnant, and since you can't put them outside, you never need to worry about putting them back in the barn. And an additional side effect is now you'll have more time to interface with the other half-baked systems, like the combat, furthering the slog and making the inadequacies more apparent. And it's like this with farming as well. Once you have irrigation pipes, you won't need to worry about anything. Now, to make the Stardew Valley comparison again, Stardew has sprinklers that act similar, but there are different levels of this that force you to rethink how you plan out your farm. In Monster Harvest, you just lay out the lines of pipe, and then don't need to worry about farming anymore. You don't even need to spend any stamina to plant seeds or harvest the crops. All this suggests to me is that there's a foundation here to work from, but it seems clear to me that the developers took these systems from other games without really understanding how and why they were fun in the first place. So, value-wise, is it worth it? Well, I go by $1 per hour to judge whether or not a game is worth it. Monster Harvest is valued at $16.99 USD, and I put 20-something hours into it, so technically I got my value out of this game. As I said though, this value of time is coming from something that just wasn't that fun. But if everything I said didn't scare you off, then I'd imagine you'd get your bang for your buck. However, I think waiting is probably the best for this. It's not an early access game, but the devs apparently have updates planned for this. The first big update they want to put out is a festival update to overhaul them and give the villagers more things to say and the player something to do at each festival. Because yeah, right now the festivals are just a joke. Actually, I think the devs plan to have interactions with the so-called contests or competitions, judging from what the NPCs will say, but the functionality was never implemented. Although, I honestly don't understand how you have something like a fishing competition, but don't actually have a way for the player to interact with this. It's mind-boggling to me. In one Steam review, I read the devs state that, quote, "The decision to go ahead with the full launch versus early access can be a tough call. You could pick the point in development where you feel you've implemented everything, and the feedback you're receiving is all positive, and that's what we did after a beta test." End quote. I wonder how large the sampling pool was for this beta test, though. I didn't understand a lot of the game design decisions here because I felt so much was lacking. I think if they released it under the early access moniker, then some of those things could be overlooked. In order for me to return to this game and for any potential buyers, I'd say that the devs would need to overhaul the monster combat system. There needs to be more interesting choices in fights. Branching from that, I think a good move would be to try and think of ways in which periphery systems, like fishing or mining, might feed into the Pokemon aspect of the game. They have a setup with the farming, but I think that could be taken further as well. Bottom line, this game isn't really that great, and I think its lackluster systems will ultimately bore a player, making them want to play either Stardew Valley or Pokemon. Actually, I'd say any one of the Rune Factory games would probably be a nice compromise of a farming game with monsters. With that, thanks so much for watching. Do you own Monster Harvest? If so, what did you think? I hope this video helped you in some way, and if it did, then please leave a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks again, and have a nice day.